Hi everyone, and welcome to the video on adaptation. What we're going to be doing in this video is another in our module 4 part 3 series looking at classification and evolution, and in this one we'll be having a look at specification reference 4.2.2g, the different types of adaptations of organisms to their environment. Let's start off then with the definition of adaptation. And quite simply, when we are referring to an adaptation in biology, we are talking about a characteristic that enhances the survival of an organism in the habitat. So the adaptations that these organisms have will help them to cope with various environmental stresses. And we can categorize these adaptations as being either anatomical, behavioral, or physiological. And what we're going to do is go through each of those in turn to see what we mean by them and give some examples in each case. If we start off with the anatomical adaptations first of all. When we're talking about anatomical adaptations, these are structural changes that are occurring to the organism. And they are any change to the structure of that organism that might enhance its survival chance. So if we give a good example here, then we're going to be having a look at some of these plants that live on sand dunes. Now, sand dunes are not the most hospitable environments that we have here on planet Earth, and therefore the plants that exist on them have to have these anatomical adaptations to allow them to actually cope with all those different environmental stresses that they're going to experience. So the first one is the roots. So the roots of these plants that live on sand dunes tend to be really quite long. The idea being that if they've got these long roots, they're going to go deeper into the ground, and that's where they may well find some little reserves of water. Their roots are also quite widespread. Idea behind that is twofold. First, it helps to stabilize the sand because you don't want the ground you're actually planted in to be shifting around you continuously. And secondly, when water is available, they can absorb large quantities of it very easily because they've got these very widespread roots, which allows them to absorb more water. If we think about the structure of their leaves next, then they've got a low stomatal density. So what that means is that per square centimetre of the leaf, then they have quite a low number of stomata present. And the idea behind that is to reduce the amount of water vapour that is lost from those leaves through transpiration. Because hopefully we remember from our module 3 work that transpiration is the loss of water vapour from the aerial parts of the plant, i.e. the leaves, and that occurs through the stomata. So if we have fewer stomata, there's less loss of water vapour, and that's going to be beneficial to these plants that maybe don't have very high supplies of water available to them. They also have this thick waxy cuticle on the surface of their leaf, and the thick waxy cuticle just reduces the amount of evaporation that can take place there. Still with the leaf, we can also find that they can curl their leaves. Now, curling the leaf is actually a very clever way of reducing the surface area that's exposed. And what it's going to do is it's going to trap the air inside that curled area, which means that the concentration gradient between the inside and the outside of the leaf is reduced. And if we reduce concentration gradients, we reduce the likelihood of evaporation taking place. If we then consider the lower epidermis of our leaves, these can be folded. Now, the whole idea of folding that lower epidermis is that the stomata are then going to be located inside the fold. So as water evaporates and forms that water vapour on the outside of the stomata, it's going to basically get trapped in the fold, and therefore we're going to reduce the concentration gradient between the inside and the outside, which means we reduce that diffusion. Last one, having hairs on the lower epidermis. This is all about reducing air movement around obviously the lower part of our leaf, and therefore water vapour accumulates near that lower epidermis, once more reducing the concentration gradient. So you've probably noticed there's a bit of a theme with these, that it's all about making sure we can get as much water as possible from the surroundings while reducing the water loss from the plant as much as possible. The second category of our adaptations are the behavioural ones. Now, behavioural adaptations are changes to the organism's behaviour that again enhances its survival chance. So if we think about examples in animals, then we may well find that there's animals that are going to retreat to their burrows. So basically when something comes into contact with it, it's going to then just dive back underground for safety. If we think about something that you may see lurking around in your homes and gardens, well, hopefully not in your homes, then you have probably seen hedgehogs, hopefully not just the smushed ones in the road. And their protective feature is that they're going to roll into a ball. Now, obviously that's a behaviour adaptation. They've learned how to roll up to then protect themselves from predators, not so much cars. And therefore, by doing so, they are more likely to survive. Examples in plants, because they can also modify their behaviour, they're not just sitting there, people, then they can roll their leaves, so that is a behavioural adaptation, and they can also close their stomata, so that what we can see there is they've got two different ways that they can modify what they're doing to increase their chances of survival. Third category, the physiological adaptations, affect the way that the processes are working inside the organism. So this could be modifications to aerobic pathways or switching to an anaerobic pathway if you don't have enough of the oxygen available for the aerobic. If we think about an example from animals then, first of all, on our physiological, let's go to mosquitoes, everyone's least favourite insect. So mosquitoes are pesky because what they're going to do is they're going to find you, or at least find the person that attracts the mosquitoes in your local group, and then they're going to have a nice little feast on you. The reason they can do that is because they actually produce a chemical that stops blood clotting. If they didn't, what would happen is as soon as they pierce through the skin, there's that damage to the capillaries, and what is going to happen is your body is going to start that blood clotting cascade, and as a result their meal dries up. So not very beneficial. So they've developed this chemical that they then release at that point of obviously getting into the skin, and that prevents the blood from clotting, so they can have as much of a feast on your blood as they fancy. In terms of plants, what we find is that they can actually increase the number of lignified cells that are present to actually provide greater support when the turgidity of those cells is lost. So if we've got low water conditions, they can actually lay down greater amounts of lignin within the cell walls and therefore provide support for those plants. Before we leave our ideas of adaptation, we do need to mention a process called convergent evolution. Now, if we have a little look at the two pictures of moles at the bottom that I've given you, we've got the marsupial mole on the left and the placental mole on the right. And when we look at them, they look pretty similar. Obviously they're different colours and there's a couple of little differences between them, but on the most part you look at them and think, yeah, they're pretty closely related. Now, the key thing about these is that actually they're not that closely related. And the reason that they look similar to one another isn't because they've evolved from a common ancestor in the relatively recent past, but because they both happen to have a similar lifestyle, they're living in a similar habitat to each other, so underground in both of their cases, which means that those same adaptations are going to be advantageous to both. So all that's happened is, even though they've had completely separate evolutionary paths, because they've been existing in that same kind of environment underground, then the same adaptations have given them a survival advantage. So having that really silky fur so that they've got less friction with the walls of their burrows, that's an advantage. Therefore, they both happen to have it these days. What we do find is this convergent evolution is just what happens when they've got these independent evolutionary paths, but the same adaptations have been advantageous. So basically they've got a lot of common characteristics even though they don't share that common ancestor. As always, I hope you found this video useful, and of course don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when the next video is uploaded, and head on over to the website where you can find a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.